Okay. Yeah. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening here and out there on Crowdcast. It's a real pleasure to welcome Laynie Browne and Carla Harryman, who will both give readings, followed by a conversation about the anthology A Forest on Many Stems, Essays on the Poet's Novel, published, edited by Laynie and published by Nightboat Books. Yay, Nightboat. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Mike Wendt. I'm the program director here at Woodland Pattern. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement and say that in Milwaukee, we live and work on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homelands along the southwest shores of Michigami, part of North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnick rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We further acknowledge the grave evil colonialism introduced to these lands through genocide as well as slavery, but also via racist and xenophobic beliefs, laws, and practices that continue to inflict harm upon Black, Brown, and Indigenous lives. We honor those who have lived and do live now at these intersections of identity and experience and are committed to the active dismantling of white supremacy. Once again, thank you all so much for tuning to host Carla and Laynie to celebrate this anthology and also some recent publications by each of them. So we'll begin the event this evening with some readings. First, Laynie Browne will read, then Carla Harryman, before moving on to the conversation about A Forest on Many Stems, as well as poets' novels and cross-genre literary works, maybe more generally. Out in the front, if you're interested and here with us, there are books for sale, or if you're out there, you can find us online, or come in if you're near enough and just couldn't be here in person tonight. But okay. Oh, there will be a chance during the conversation, I should say, for questions, both for those of you here in the room and those of you tuning in on Crowdcast. Those of you here can just like old-fashioned, raise your hand and I'll come to you with a microphone. And then those of you on Crowdcast can type questions really at any point throughout in the chat, and then at the appropriate time I will read those, as many as we're able to get to. And I'll remind you of that as we switch over to that part of the evening. Any case, for now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Laynie Browne and Carla Harryman, who I will introduce at the same time, and then I can just get out of the way and let them have the floor. Laynie Browne's recent books include a collection of poems, a translation of the Lilies Back into Lists from Wave Books, a novel, Periodic Companions, and a book of short fiction, The Book of Moments. Her poetry has been translated into French, Spanish, Chinese, and Catalan. She edited the anthology A Forest on Many Stems, Essays on the Poet's Novel, and co-edited the anthology I'll Drown My Book, Conceptual Writing by Women. Her honors include a Pew Fellowship, the National Poetry Series Award, and the Contemporary Poetry Series Award. She teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. Carla Harryman is the author of 24 books of poetry, prose, and performance writings, as well as a number of essays on performance and feminist poetics, including Obituary of the Many, on the obituary by Gail Scott, published in A Forest on Many Stems. She has published 2 novels, The Words, after Carl Sandburg's Rutabaga Stories and Jean-Paul Sartre, and Gardener of Stars. Recent publications include A Voice to Perform, 1 opera, 2 plays, a 2-volume French and English edition of poetry and performance writing, Sue in Berlin and Sue à Berlin, and the Poets Theater play, Good Morning. She's the recipient of the Foundation for Contemporary Art Grants for Artists in Poetry and the Ronald C. Collins Distinguished Faculty Award in Creative Activity at Eastern Michigan University, where she teaches in the Department of English. Her poem dialogue series, Cloud Cantata, it says forthcoming, but that's not true, is out in the front, available here now from Paminar Press in London. A thread that seems to run through A Forest on Many Stems, which also, to my mind, seems to characterize the writing of both Browne and Harryman, is the consideration of writing as a process, is in the creation of works that are conversational, polyvocal, multifaceted, and multiversal, which is to say, inhabiting both multiple verse and other forms, and multiple overlapping universes, identities, times, places, etc. Or perhaps it's better to borrow from Laynie Browne's own introduction to A Forest on Many Stems and say that both of the writers joining us this evening, quote, court the uncategorizable, respond to the uniqueness of the present, and resist predictability. Join me in welcoming Laynie Browne and Carla Harryman.
Thank you so much, Michael and Woodland Pattern and Carla for organizing this. I'm so happy to be here. And to everybody watching wherever you are. I wanted to just briefly introduce this book. So I started out with this idea to take my daily to-do list and write a translation of it every single day, item by item, line by line, as a way to have something more than my to-do list, which I love, but also is kind of making me crazy. And so every poem is a list poem titled with a date and numbered, but I don't read the numbers. It starts in the middle of December 2015 and goes through May of 2016. And it's one in a series of books that I'm writing for individual female poets, which have made my work possible as a poet, from whom I've received so much. So this is a book for the poet C.D. Wright, who sadly, tragically passed when I had been writing this book for about a month. So it became elegy. So it went from list poem, day, book, translation, elegy. So a lot of different forms going on. And then this book also has original collage in it, which I'll say more about in a moment. But I wanted to offer invitation. One way that this book can be read is by divination. So you could pick a date anytime between December 16th and May 23rd. So just think about that. If you have a date, if you have a request, and I'll start with a request from in the room or online. And I think that's all. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say is that the title is inspired by C.D. Wright's title, Translation of the Gospels Back into Tongues. So that's really the only formal relationship for this particular book, but I wrote it for her. So there's a collage for every month in the book. Collages I was making at the time I was writing and decided later to put them together with the book. The collages are color. In the book, they're black and white, and each one has one line which goes with it. So I wanted to start by showing the collages in color. It's also the first time I've ever put my collages into a book. I've always had the practices separate and secret kind of collage making, but here they are. So I will start with the entire room then became a person I knew in many bodies. If the heroine does not descend to the underworld, does she retreat inside a child? Discard those formerly fallen, crystallized selves. I changed the color of my ink each time I died. Words have their own minds. What was it exactly we could not resist? And That's the collages. Does anyone have a request of a date in between December 16th and May 23rd? Between December 16th and May 23rd. And there isn't one for every single day, but most days, so I could pick one close to the day. Anyone else have a date they want to call out? Or somebody online, maybe, if not in the room? March 14th. All right. Let's see. March 14th, 2016. These words exist to be your friend, placating every feather in the unwalking rain. You could say the garment cascades down her sides, but how many sides have you seen? A captive feminism so variable the weave rearranges itself each minute. Another sequestered self. Once dressed, she danced in any weather. A word I have looked up over and over and don't understand any better. I reread the handwritten letter on lavender paper, then ripped it to shreds. The floor became visible for the first time in months. Arriving home from various travels, we place our minds here and there in canvas bags, trying to type while holding open a dictionary with both hands, as if either side of the book were the back of a bird, an efficient console loading the base of palms with content. Do we really exist in program notes, train tickets, and postcards? No coincidence in coming to the end of a handwritten journal as one book expires and another begins. You carry the remnants of trees on your lap, firs flat and fragrant, crown, knees. One line of light bisects each needle. When agitation rose beyond reason, you entered the chamber, hung low and verdant. Your voice alone bristled, walking, page-turning, opening cupboards and drawers. You consumed all available air, leaving me tarnished, incomparable, not fit for any civilized compass. I stalked cameos, those iridescent replicas of women, or merely their glimmering blue profiles. The last time we lived inside drawings with nothing in common, rooms with pulled shades, we must learn to be separate persons. After decades, we still sometimes forget. Falsely idealized marrow. My demise was reverentially planned. I underlined the selves, later to be replaced. We do not stop when arms grow tired. I exist to be your friend. Wow, I haven't ever read that one. Thanks. And postcards reminded me that I have postcards, so if anybody wants one, with the first collage image. All right. So now I'm going to read just starting in December and going towards spring, just skipping through. December 31st, 2015. 1. Is it because you don't wish to write anything? You might regret that you don't write at all? Predictably unavailable or available only on such terms as to make meeting impossible? The best friend of predictably unavailable, however, they aren't in much contact. Someone stole your name. In the novel, you don't recognize yourself. Sometimes you sign love and other times yours. I was stunned at your good manners, your poise, your attentiveness, and the formality in which you lived beside the bearded paintings. I wanted to keep going, to keep talking, but what does one say to silence? We were born together in a mythic city, and so we set out arm in arm to traverse the many decades. I hope they will be kind, and sometimes I wish I were stupid, lame, with no ambitions or thoughts, as Emily wrote, Mother does not care for thought. Fake fantasy lives which involve complacence and illusory indifference. When I returned for the first time in years, the sky was painted with fingers pink and gold, and I wondered why I ever left. You're so tall and good-natured, and I don't understand those dark commas you tuck carefully against your cheeks beside your ears. The first time we met, we spoke for hours about a personal death. You are starting so late, it seems natural to continue to be selfish. You recorded the fragments of a dying language by hanging strips of it to dry from your ceiling. Everyone thought you were my husband. We laughed. You were out of town and I missed you terribly, even though you often failed to reply. This time, a drowned doll spoke. I lifted her and smoothed her skirts and placed her on a calm shelf. I never stopped wondering. Too sick to show up, the last time we met, we reclined upon cement benches, singing in the middle of the conference. Time to read images, time to speak as we have always spoken. You write your longest poem on the shortest day. On the day that we were born is the most light. You are a new original. I wish your animated tears weren't true. February 3rd, 2016. Furiously forget yourself, then complete the online forms. Confirm, gingerbread meeting, talismans, and tarot with Emily Dickinson. Bring baskets, string, apron, and books. Explain how her bodiless white dress suspended in glass is a perfect fit. How notes are poems and also tasks. At some point, his solitary intensity turned to daggers and sloth. I walked up the paper with a neighbor discussing the need to get away. He'll say we must repave, but I prefer to endlessly stall. How different she looks when certain words emit their glow. She wore them around her neck, bound them to her thoughts, rested her face in a nest. It's all right to begin what seems distant. In fact, interrupt yourself now. My goal is to keep switching back and forth between doing and being until I disintegrate. The correct music never discusses your mood. Instead, it elevates or deflates. Form continues to morph. At first, I translated abbreviations into commentaries, opening an accordion-like discourse. But then, what was already there, between the pleats, began demanding a say. Finally, I've noticed that by the time I arrive, parenthetical graveyards have been inserted, secret obsessions slain. Hours begin instantaneously without allowing protest or assent. It's like trying to board a bus or a train at full speed. Instead, you wait, enter when doors open before you, regardless of where you may be taken. If there were once signs, maps, or signals, they have since been erased. Don't stop now. The first morning jolt of doingness is like a triple espresso. If I just sit myself down before it all begins, before dressing, before fully waking, and start with dreams. He's saying goodbye through a door, and I only half hear. Could it look all right with thoughts coiled and pinned? Maybe the right pins, but these slide so nicely. Should I stop imagining the exile of pleasure? I've developed a taste for even stronger green shots of revulsion. It's like a deal I make with myself over and over. Being invincible isn't just for mothers, but no one else knows this. Actually, the message has been sent multiple times. Should I really believe she meant to sculpt my reservations into binding backdrops? I was just standing there, minding my curtains. Too many messages, not enough mind garlands. I miss you more than you've ever repeated those words. The other night, I began stating superlatives, and you happily repeated each one. You may not remember you, me, or anyone, but I will remember us, we, and them for us all. You may not recall the meanings of words, but the tones of your voice still transmit voluminous inclinations. I wish everyone could believe the dying are still living. You are still alive. February 22nd, 2016. 1. Why do the same words I put on yesterday fall differently today? Becoming one's ancestors happens more quickly than I'd imagined. Spotting in photographs burned off to eliminate age, she collected the pictures and then copied them exactly by hand, reinvesting value in remnants discarded by their original subjects. Her brush was so minute, she knew the name of every strand. At the moment I referred to her dream of the cat husband, she sent me the photo she was taking of him. However, the image would not appear. Too many questions obviated my view. I sat down with my moon calendar, hoping to learn in phases where exactly I had been. Was my body still a viable source? Was I bewitched? Or was I only noting that I had never agreed to marry the cat husband? Because the sentence I could not fix took all of my confidence, I was also unable to win at cards, converse with lists, or make adequate use of dusk. Just as he was about to throw away the empty box of chocolates, I decided to insert portraits in place of each confection. And while cutting off a woman's head and replacing it with the torso of a naked baby leaning over a formal tea table, I soon realized something else had begun. The alarming fear of who might leave next, as if you had just invented the idea of death. I ripped an image of a pale hand on a lute, tore trees from forests, and pasted a salamander on the gowned infant's chair. When she sat down, she would be surprised, but isn't that always how things go? Since the image is affixed with glue, the salamander is safe. When I lose momentum, I try not to stop. Fear of a sentence, fear of language, fear of speaking on the telephone, because certain powers must be approached in careful qualities. The time of day is important. When one must speak an unpleasant word, do so in the middle of the day. Words of affection have more effect in the evening. Love penetrates the middle of the night. In the morning, I drank my nettles and ran up the stairs. April 8th, 2016. The light blew through my words, but a shadow of my hand remained. Fine to be a chronicler of social ills, but can you live on that? I got myself up, exercised, fed, clean, and set, and then I went to harvest something to counteract drudgery, cynicism, and even fate. I write against the hopeless moment, the one when we realize how little difference our efforts make. I wrote against your body, my favorite pressure. I write because you wrote, and in your words we all had words. Inside, the word inside is shelter. Come inside. April 21st, 2016. I'll tell you when you get to fall apart, she said to herself. Not now. The month was running away with itself. Nothing I could do. Actually, your list has never been longer, which means you have a strange way of populating nothing. The 10,000 flowering objects, mouths, timetables, ingredients. Waiting is most difficult when one is waiting. Wait and wade and wide. When is it safe to wrap you in a blanket and allow you to dream? She recreated me over the phone, then told me how long to immerse, pluck, mix, and braise. What would you fold into these leaves? Secure packages with paint and psalms with science. Your paper letter arrived reminding me of our new name. Insects wrote books. Now I know I'm you, me, and everyone. You have already survived your darkest power. And finally, May 11th, 2016. Gratitude, my sister, we often quarrel. Our kid's almost the age at which we first met. I can't sleep with the door open, I wrote. And then I got up and closed the door. Morning sanctuary supports me even though I am not awake. Do you know morning sanctuary? Sitting beside me, you took my hand, touched my hair. You didn't speak many eyes, but you were blue silk, lemon, like indigo in a poem, an abstract, luminous presence. I can no longer visit my grandmother's house. Not only is our invented childhood over, we've also spent the childhoods of our children. First, later meant throwing everything in a closet when they were small. Second, later becomes a further projection, the desire for a time when everything is less devastating. Dear missing conspirators of birth and page, assist us in finding words not to beautify, but to understand beyond surfaces. Thank you.
So we're standing in front of a painting called She's Love by Adele John, and there's a room full of these works, these portraits that were amidst. So I'm going to read primarily from this new little book, Cloud Cantata. It's the second work in a trilogy of what one might call dialogue poems. The first book in the trilogy was actually published in a PAJ, the Journal of Performance and Art, as a play. The editor called it a play, and I accepted it being a play because, as we have discussed, there's some flickering between and among genres happening, and but I'm delighted to have this book out by Paminar, which is in the poetry zone, and I'm going to also just look at I'm not going to follow the list as I wrote it of what I was going to read tonight, but it will help me find my way. That is, if I can find the list, and if I can't, I might have written it on a weird page. Oh no, I've got it, great. But somehow when I was coming up to read, a little voice told me that I had to read this. Usually I start near the beginning, but that I had to read late to work. I don't know why. Oh, I should also mention that these dialogue works have all been written during the pandemic period, so they started in the pandemic period, and this also has these dates, so that's also resonates with your work, the January to September 2021. So it's also a kind of similar time period, which is curious. Late to work. You know, I woke up late and fell into a reverie that lasted until 4:58 p.m. I knew you were away, so I went about my business, some of which was tearful. Do you want company? Tell me about where you were or how you were before you joined me now. I don't know if it is the same. I was broken-hearted too, though. There was a spirit mending the broken, bound by a few living persons. I think I was lying down on the job for much of it on the settee, with my legs flopped over the edge. More and more, I find myself gravitating to small futures. The dog goes well with the settee. Yes, they are matchy-matchy, but I colonized it. She was scratching herself and sleeping on the floor. I don't know why I said that. You mean characterizing the dog as a decorative object? I imagined her, but not you. You've seen me lying down most nights for the past several decades. When one is in a reclining position awake, one may be addressing their thoughts to another person, or making love, or in their own head, or practicing nonviolent civil disobedience, or just disobedience, or maybe they are objected by power, recovering from an accident or surgery, or watching the stars expand their sense of insignificance in the universe. Who knows what goes on in the dog's mind? Sometimes I think any posture one imagines abstractly involves a prejudice or bias. Consider the metaphor lying down on the job. I think that's interesting because I was lying down on the job. I wasn't working, but missing things, people, my friend from the West Side staging a pyrotechnic universe of abject reality while contradicting such brutality by how he went about making this happen. Detroit finally put in streetlights, but the illumination coming from his mind has been filtered by the artifice of utility, by a curtaining or waiting for, by a temporally indefinite striating. The job is everywhere, and in that sense, every time you lie down on it, you lay on it. I hadn't thought of that. No, who has? You did, just now. But was the thought just an idle in reverse? I'll consider the question and let you know. I have to get over this feeling. What feeling? The tearful one, that's all. It's now 5:15. The day stalls in passing time. The casket opens. My friend doesn't look like my friend. You don't have to report on your sadness, but I am sorry. What is your relationship to time travel? Would you like to walk over to the brewery? It's been about 18 months. The measure of 2 full-term pregnancies. I'd rather just open a beer. I've never had beer for breakfast. It's 5:20, so you skipped breakfast and went straight to the off hours. Whoever gets off work at 5 p.m. anymore? Somebody, but you weren't working anyway. You said everything is a job, and that's why lying down on the job is still being at work. Something like that. Awkward flirtation. Good morning, Valentine. The breakfast is a variation of its earlier incarnations, and for that I also thank you. Something haunts the phrase, "Good morning, Valentine." Was that a horror flick? Not Silence of the Lambs, maybe My Bloody Valentine, A Gift to the End of Community, and dancing, which I do miss, after all the yoga, especially the squats, feet and toe strengthening, and third chakra discipline, did you ever wake up to the idea we are in the third decade of the 21st century, another time span of downward spiral as we move toward heart's desire? That's exactly my thinking too, a chaotic image of why we have remained together for, I'm going to put on the Shostakovich. I fold the heart into the spiral, jamming its system. Then there's a pulsing, and it keeps pulsing and banging too, a form in which blood and muscle meets vascular system and clanging metal. It's an image I could draw better than I can describe with words. But perhaps you get a sense of how everything can change as we speak. And the direction? The direction is an artifice. Who said I like artifice? It's your surrogate's declaration from another decade. You had a lot of these before and after we tasted the wish list. When you mentioned my having a lot, did you mean of surrogates or declarations? Are you in the mood to pass the salt? Let me think about it. The amorous potential of your question. May I offer you my arm for a little lick? Hyperbole stalls at the sight of flesh. We descend into the salt mines. What point on the spiral is that? The concept that preserves our bodies. I am finding this flirtation awkward. Is that? Never mind. Never mind. Please pass the salt. I thought you would be the one to pass it. Okay, then how about turning up the Shostakovich? Self-expression. I was dreaming I was on a boat. It was not a skiff, and I was on a lounge chair, the kind that people knit things on in movies. I was stitching X's, minuses, and pluses into the scar on my arm. It's a game I often play in my head while I'm doing other things. I'm thinking about a play with the words in the title, Let Us Go Away. By Gertrude Stein, yes? Did it hurt? No, in the dream, scars don't hurt, but we do go away. Yes, good morning. Do let us go away. That's the name of the play, but I am still thinking about the bizarre stitching, undiscussable in a Stein play. I wouldn't know. When you described the symbols of the stitches, I couldn't tell if you meant X as in multiplication or cancel, or as in X romance attachment. This value is, I think, important to our understanding of minus and plus. V is coming over for breakfast, and that's a plus, no matter what X means in your symbol set. It's getting late. I could call them. Their phone is off. You can tell because the voice response picks up instantly. It is a radiant thing that V can be comfortable indoors. The romantic breeze gently nudges them in our direction. You and your ironics, I just want to express myself about something. Those stitches in my scars may well be an homage to V's cultivation of mathematical aptitude. I don't like to quantify past lives or loves, even if I do have a thing for scars. What about the game? Things get combined in strange ways in dreams, so what's the problem? I do keep playing it mostly when I'm awake. This time, a game seeped into sleep, and now it's part of the day's stalled future. Show me your arm. That's a demand. You've had access to it day and night for how long? Now you want me to show the arm in an instance of friend becoming a territory? It's faded. The scar is no longer raised above the skin surface. It's flattened. What did you expect? I don't know. You know about being between jobs, ideas, nations. This is landscape. You know about being between jobs, ideas, nations. It's the nation thing that's bugging me. We're being bugged? You better believe it. You can't walk down the street without the days. Days? Here's some coffee. It will help clear up the present. Are you feeling tense? Yes, as in between the national thing. I don't like it. One world is ruptured and the other is founded in the absolute openness of everything to everything. Are you quoting Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka? I raid around between times in a daze in order to avoid the feeling of being bugged. The air is moist, and down the street, a housing disaster. Which one? The giant tombstone they are building on the big lot, or they're taking the house away after the water had been turned back on? Did you see the rowboat the neighbor has set out at the edge of their driveway? The one who used to have the skeleton tableau, a bar scene? Now that is gone, and there's the battered boat slathered in pink and blue pastel paint. The wreck is being cared for. A bit of chaos and goodwill between rupture and openness. On the other side of the road is a surveillance camera planted in the middle of the lawn. How do you know it's a surveillance camera? I did a double take. First, there is no one, and then the missing welcome party, the boat wreck, a suspension between erosion and desperation is what I think when I'm not being looked at. The evil eye stopped me in my tracks. I did a double take, and now everything is clearer back where I started. I want to say, welcome home, but recall automaton sincerity at passport control. I am now trying to find other words. They're here in the book, but I can't find my place. I was looking at it and forgot to mark it. We'll find the spot later. This dodging of border security is, forget it, what? The description. Grand Prix. As if in a, the lawn of submerged cherry red and white convertible. Over there, the acousmatic gong. The brain without dutiful. Investment. Instrument in the day to come. Not awake. Yes, not really, though. The car is actual. Yes, that. Clear statement, though. It rains. Again. Not pausing for. Season. Grand Prix. A prism. For landscape duty, have you been reading poetry? Yes. These are the best slices of white nectarine. Thank you, not to be confused with poetry my mother knew too. It need not be novel. Always, I mean, what do you make of the car? A date reclaimed, which reminds me, will you meet me in Detroit? This evening? It is almost evening, now in a certain mood, drawn to mineral, craving mineral, sinking with hours left of the day, I saw you fall and repeat the fall. Ocean approaching Berlin. A speck of someone in the middle of a Berlin street out in the open. Clandestinely, isn't it I? Or something else, telescoping out to a view still close in of many streets with people hiding in reconstruction doorways, several of them on varying cobbled and narrowed and paved streets, some so broad and straight they exhaust the idea of walking to where one is going, but there are also people out and about, though I sense not for enjoyment. Then I recall enjoyment, a noisy recall, as option, and a falling in love sensation tracks my tracking from the ocular position of a digital surveillance device you also have on your computer. So I see that I am replicating Google Maps, but in 3D. This world is too barren. Fullness goes missing. An ocean of sound swells and recedes through the spaces left in the absence of traffic noise. A broom scratches across a ground floor patio, already clean as a whistle. Then the ocean of sound, then the broom scratching, then an exhale ending in a whistle. The sweeper lowers self slowly onto a cushioned patio chair seat. The sound wells up in splashes, washing out higher pitches. Elements intercede in elements. An ocean approaches Berlin. The spray quietly courses through the city, unhampered by encroaching waves and the threat of boundlessness, of water bodies mixed in cocktails of sorrow and flashes of blue light through a hospital window on one side of the spray, and then the other, a fugue of blue flashes, brooms brushing surfaces. Time blinks in their hypnosis. Time blinks in their hypnosis. It blinks and again blinks unwittingly, attracting tracking radar. A device in nowhere plucks at time with the assistance of the tracking. Track and pluck, track and pluck. Then a wave of sound almost swallowing the city in a seductive wish coming from a mind in there, out there. That's something else telescoping, not me, or just neural phenomena. Then a literal wave threatening to crash the spray, nevertheless, nerveless and brusque. The spray, nerveless and brusque. The through line continues its direction to merge with the Havel, flow into the Elbe, enter the North Sea, the landlocked Baltic via the Kiel Canal, radionuclides flow into a scientist's sample gatherings. The sweeper again sits down slowly on a cushioned patio chair, this time on an ocean liner, this time on a skiff carrying scientific gear to testing sites. Someone faint and far may be sweeping ocean surface, a sound of completing a task of breathing out a little heavily, of painstaking movements, and the pleasure in calibrated gesture. Time blinks again, loses a relay falling on the tracking signal, and then the whole apparatus. Where did the time go? Someone asks from inside a garage I am passing, out in Spandau or suburb of a different city. Time doesn't hold water. It washes through a child's voice coming through the speakerphone. I or that not me, something else have overheard a private conversation again, captive to or captivated by surveillance. Again, dreams circling back to where you and I live or have lived or will be living under time's resoundings. Fugue. It looks like the omelet is more ready than I. All my dreams were empty. Is it worth my asking what is an empty dream? A speck of a someone on a Berlin street in overexposed light. I did tell you I'm not fully present. Your surrogate's declaration from another decade, as in, your dog goes well with the satay. I notice you're in the habit of interrupting me this morning. I am rehearsing for the part of a murderess, with the sun fanning the window. Now she's brushing her hair, then I turn off the TV and look at you with a wet mouth. Where? Out the window? Again, a dim sense that having been chased and surveilled in scenarios of chaos and surveillance and chaos puts me in another era, one that straddles this era when I wake up. There are, of course, libations used to wet tongues. Mine is on the moist side, as it issues the sonic landscape behind its gushing sorcery, a scenery confused with poetry my mother also knew, while I was struggling with a zipper, certainly not on your own, and now you are leaving the house to do what? I'm going to the park with the dog and eat junk food on a bench while you sit in the backyard in a lawn chair and read Merleau-Ponty, tired from pulling weeds, and wait for some attorney to call. But I can't tell a witness. We're being bugged. The person to get more intel from is, where? In Texas? Are you drinking Octave? And then I'm going to close the reading with two of the dialogues from the last part of the trilogy, which is now tentatively titled Scales for the Living. And so the first piece from this I'm reading is to Ukrainian, Russian, Ukrainian poets. Checking email every 5 minutes for an answer. I got it, I got the answer, and it didn't make me look so good. Pounding on your own goodness sounds a bit tarnishing. Say, stinging. Have a latke. The smell of onion and the vapor of potato reminds me of the Russian poets in our kitchen drinking vodka at a somewhat earlier hour than this. They did not sleep. They do not sleep much now either. Up all night in your fantasy, some of them are dead. No, not in mine. In mine, they sleep willowy sorts of idealism, smothering vast plains sequestered in small farms and mushroom gathering. That reminds me of your line about still being alive. They are almost all gone now, but there are more. Some, Alexei. Others, too, are lauded on the lips of the still living. Alexei turned vitriol blue. I thought it was a reference to hydrated copper. Ukrainian rubble recalls each dead poet in Russia as Ukrainian. They have to be careful now. That rubble disseminates in the elements spreading across the globe as ever, but more so, tabling the turn and turning. So let them leave as they did. They leave again and again. So and so is arriving, a ways off. They are arriving. We break hearts with them when they arrive with stoic pretense. And then we get out the vodka. They have not yet slept. We keep the vodka in the freezer in case someone is looking for it. I confess, I didn't understand entirely these males, but Alexei, now understanding, forget. I was a poet in the company of Alexei. The point is dispersed in rubble. Yes, forget understanding, and never made again in the same way. That's right, it's missing varnish. March 20th, 2022. And this is the one that follows this, called Scale 12. Why I Am Not a Poet. You remember that track? The one about painting? Sure, I remember. It does that substitution thing when one thing is substituted for another. But they are not equivalent, are they? No, it just makes negative attribution proliferate. Kitschy hearts flying out of storm drains and into cracks. Meanings slip through as they do now in a time of war. When there wasn't one, a time of war? You think there wasn't? No. You interrupted that I was going to say we weren't alive. Ad infinitum, so we don't know what to grease, oil, or paint, how to brush stroke in the battleground of thoughts when poets haven't studied war sufficiently. Ain't gonna study war no more, remember? It felt good to sing, to have some fervor in the work of protest, that hot and dull straggling of the poetic so-called, then the body got left out of the picture at the end, of conscription, so that the picture slams into the returning soldier's front door. It's still morning, and who's the straggler now? In Mali, their light switch flipped unto nothing can be known, though it can be described, names named, denials met. There is something I wanted to say about Ukraine because the taste of war strikes in the neighborhood, and one can say the window imagined the subject returning to face the hearth, singing accusations, while the poet has to be cosmopolitan and know everybody while envisioning peace without leaving you out of the poem. Your characterization is likely to piss someone off. You know, I've been thinking about the inside and the outside. The soldier's window slammed into the front door picture, yes, and the painting of the shards they pull out of their arm, the drops of cartoon red, the cherry market. I've been thinking about those pissed off poets throwing poems to the wolves. That wasn't my point. I was thinking about the inside and the outside, not plucking at sentiment. Is the scale we use in conversation appropriate to the sounds we wish to make? Okay, that's it. Thanks. I think we should pause for a few seconds. You may be more ready than me.
You can pause for a second.
Just collect oneself.
I'm so tempted just to ask you about your reading, but we have this whole other book to talk about.
I realized, I know we have to talk about the other book, and I really want to. This was really important in terms of coming here, but I realized that the reason I started with the dialogue that was basically about sleeping until 4 in the afternoon or whatever, lying down on the job, that there were all of these like little elegiac snippets in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, I don't know why my mind is telling me to read this, because I couldn't remember the content of the work. And I thought, but I have to read it because something's telling me to read it. And then I realized,
It was
why?
the content of the work. Right. Well, I could start with just how the origin of the book is, if we're ready.
Yes, that would be lovely,
Okay.
is to start with the origin of the book, and maybe with something that you were mentioning today about being very interested in the fact that many of these novels that you were compelled by didn't have, there wasn't any writing about them that you could find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I became enamored of many novels written by poets, and no one had written anything about them. And I was also trying to write a novel as a poet. And so the origin of the book was that I wanted to know what a lot of interesting, intelligent poets thought about the form. In other words, I didn't want to be thinking in a vacuum. And so I had this in my mind for many years before I put out the call to certain writers who I knew might have a certain relationship to a particular book or a particular author that I was interested in. And then other writers who I just really wondered what they would say about the form. And I think the foremost question was, is it a thing? Does the poet's novel exist? Which I still have the same question. In other words, the anthology wasn't to answer that question. The anthology was to ask many interesting poets and poet scholars, what do you think? Is this a thing? And which books fascinate you the most? Or what would you say about this particular book? So I started out with a list of people I wanted to know what they thought and books that I wanted to know. And then it kept growing because I was interested in enlarging my understanding, which happened.
Mm-hmm.
So it started as kind of an ecstatic reading process and rereading these certain novels that I was interested in. and then reading novels that I might not have read or I might not have thought of in this context. And then the fact that I was asking poets, everybody who wrote for the book is a poet, meant that the way that they would approach writing essays as poets would be different than if it were a straight up academic essay, which there's a wide variety of ways to approach the essay. And I was really delighted every time. I was so surprised at where a poet went with the essay. In other words, I didn't know where they would go, and that was a plus.
So that, I have a number of thoughts about this, but one also has something to do with what we were talking about a little bit earlier today, and that has to do with like this sort of area of poetics. And so there's a number of publications that have been put out by writers, let's start at the kind of mid-century, so from the New Americans forward, Poetics Journal, Language Poetry, where that particular project had this incredible diversity of approaches to the essay, and some of them were like crazy Derridian readings, and some of them were scholarly, and some of them were involved first-person narrative that got into literary analysis, and most of the writers, but not all of them, were poets, poet critics. But so this seems to me, and then there was this anthology that was put out some years ago called A Guide to Poetics Journal, which is this big fat, it's almost as fat as your book, but maybe not quite as fat, which is a selection from those. And it has this kind of resonance with the variety of ways to approach writing. But then this is like focused specifically on this question of the novel, but it's one of the first like big absorbing books that I've read that do this thing with the essay as a work that's also focused on a literary object of some form or another. And so it just was really exciting for me to read this, and then it opened up all of these, the sense of this is just the beginning of something. But I'm not quite sure, I'm not quite sure what it is. And, some of that I think occurs to me at this moment, listening to you talk, that I'm wondering if an aspect of your interest has to do with a desire to kind of, I don't know if it's recast or re-weight something, or like sort of shift a kind of weight of attention related to literary reception and categories.
Interesting.
And then the novel, this hybrid form becomes a kind of example of some kind of desire.
I guess one desire is I feel like I always have to be reading multiple genres, and I have always had a love for the novel. And I feel like some poets are anti-novel, or they don't want to read a novel. But these novels are different than a lot of novels. So I guess partially it's my love of the novel and what it can be, like the potential for the novel. In other words, a novel doesn't have to be one thing. It could be many things.
Can you say what a first novel that drew your attention to that thought would have been?
I mean, one that I read probably longest ago was H.D.'s Hermione, and I was just so in love with the language and the questions of identity that she was exploring. What does it take to be an artist as a woman in the particular time, and how the language sometimes literally circles and expresses this sense of containment that she felt the need to get out of. So that was one. And then I feel like, well, there's always more and more, and there's so much that's not in the book that's happening now. But then when I think of kind of contemporaries, I think of someone like Renee Gladman's work that's just astoundingly amazing to me what she's doing. And so she started out writing poetry, and she says, no, I'm a fiction writer. But she allowed this to be in the poet's novel, even though she's a fiction writer and now a visual artist as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really have words to say what is so exciting in this moment. Like, I don't have that prepared. But one thing is that the focus on what language is, language as a material, which is an ongoing obsession for a lot of us. Like, what is it, and what can we do with it, and how can we not be limited by the limits of language? What do we have to do to get beyond the limits of language? And I feel like her work is exploring that in ways that are just so exciting.
And I guess there's a lot of abstract questions one could ask, and I don't know if I want to get too abstract, so maybe I'll just bracket that a little bit, because there's this connection to whatever question about or pressure on language you're asking that's also related to genre. And once one starts to think about genre and form, this becomes like a gigantic historical current that's impossible to account for in a single book. But I was thinking, okay, well, I was very interested in, when I was quite young, in books that weren't supposed to be called novels, like Rabelais, Gargantua, and Pantagruel. In fact, in that period of time, in college, if you were in an English department or in literary studies, you weren't supposed to read anything in translation. And then, so anyway, there's this thread of the novel that's not a novel at different moments because of the way that it's classified and described critically. And then, so I guess a question would be, is this thing that we're calling the poet's novel something that's a critique of the critical formations of the novel in different historical periods? And the novel becomes a place to
Sometimes.
put a pressure on that.
Sometimes, definitely. That phrase you said, books that weren't supposed to be, like that phrase, weren't supposed to be, that's always where I want to go. What we're not supposed to do, what the rules are. So I feel like I'm really fascinated with form, and I always want to know how elastic it is. So I want to know, how far can I go and still call it a novel? And that question comes up in a lot of these works. Like in Aaron Cunan's novel, The Mandarin, there's a character who's just writing a few words on his knee or on a napkin and saying it's a novel, and his friends are discussing, is it a novel? And so that's really interesting to me. And in a talk I wrote on the poet's novel, that's this little book illustrated by Noah Satterstrom, I start out with a short story by Lydia Davis that's just a few sentences, and I ask, is this a novel? Which, it's preposterous for me to say it, or to ask the question, but in a way that's why I'm asking it, because there might be 900 pages, and there's not the depths that I'm going to get with 3 sentences from Lydia Davis, so that could be a critique in a way, but... And that has something to do with narrative. So I guess that's another thing, that when you're talking about language, you're talking about language that
implicates narrative, whether it's always narrative or not narrative. I would imagine.
Maybe redefining narrative in the way that Stein redefines narrative, as in the relationship between any two words. Because we put them together, there's a relationship, and the mind creates the relationship.
In my notes, the first thing I wrote down was Browne from the introduction, a refusal to choose one form over another and an adamant acceptance of the possibility of a singular form forged by dual impulses. So that's very much coming from the thinking of the artist, like the person who's composing something. So the sense of this refusal is something that comes from a practice and then also gets translated into a concept that becomes an investigation of some kind of body of work. So then, I guess, so I wrote this, I was thinking about my own sort of early fascination with this question of the novel, and realizing that, with the exception of some of the 19th century novels, all of them were sort of outside of some kind of reception of the novel, or marginalized within it. And I made this list: Shklovsky's A Sentimental Journey, Rabelais, Lautréamont, Creeley's prose, Presence's The Island, Oulipo, so a lot of the Oulipian prose, Stein H.D., Monique Wittig, who's regendering the novel and exploding it in this linguistically utopian fashion, Williams Cora in Hell, but then there was Balzac and the Williams trilogy, and George Sand and George Eliot. That's in there too. And then I was thinking about how I was reading those books where there were these kind of like laws of genre. And so we can think about them in kinds of formal structures in which there's this sort of, conceptualization of the novel as a kind of seamless reading experience, or one that if it's a serial novel, that you're following this kind of continuum. And I could never read a novel like that. So when I was reading Balzac's Lost Illusions, I was thinking about the first, 30-some pages, that's just a description of the printing press. And there's like these little tiny plot elements being introduced into it. But I didn't think about that as sort of being absorbed into this totality. And so then that sent me to different kinds of literary theory than either the sort of standard traditional literary theory or Lukács, who I read because I was interested in Marxism, but I would not read the novel the way that he was kind of foregrounding it. So anyway, that's just a kind of sketch about something, but makes me think about how a poet might read the novel in a way that is also not about how you're learning what a novel is.
Not about extracting a narrative in a transactional way, right? Radical acts of reading.
So I don't know who here has really looked at this book. I know some people have, because Chuck said that he has checked it out of the library a couple of times already, so that's...
Wow.
But it's a book it's 600 pages. It's divided into these areas that often overlap. So it must have been incredibly hard to decide what belongs in a verse novel or a genre mashup or an interior lyric displacement, cartographic time, or prose concatenation, novel borders. And so there's like these wonderful attempts, and I like that too. They suggest, an attempt, like an essay does, to organize something, but the organization has to be open in terms of what kind of relationship you make to the heading and to the book. But it helps because it means that you can, as a reader, go through all of the examples under a heading, or certain examples, and then go to another and sort of get a dialogue going in your head.
One entrance, one possible entrance, one thing that appears, one impulse in the book.
So it helps to structure reading in interesting ways, as far as I'm concerned. And I was interested in how now you might find maybe connections between some of the books in different different categories.
Something happened today, actually, because I thought, how do I want to talk about this today? And I just pulled out a few examples and like the first paragraph of the original text. And I thought, I can just read the first paragraph of Nobézy Philippe's Looking for Livingston, and whatever. I picked 3, and when I was looking over them today, I realized that they all had to do with silence, and that wasn't intentional, but it makes me think about the negative space in poetry and the empty space. So even if it's not formally blank space on the page, there's still a fascination, not in every piece, but in the 3 that I randomly picked today to say something about.
Well then, why don't you
so
delve in?
I could briefly point to a few, and then maybe you could do the same if you feel like it. So silence, a kind of disorientation in time, which is another thing that's in a lot of these works. So if I quoted Alice Notley in an interview that's in the introduction, where she says, prose moves you forward. I'm not getting her exact words, but it's in the introduction. Prose isn't a linear enabler. It moves us forward through, and poetry sends you back to the beginning, so it's kind of cyclical. And so there's this altered sense of time in poetry versus prose that in the poet's novel we can experience that. And then a kind of indeterminacy, absence, not knowing where we are, is in the ones that I chose. So the first example was Inger Christensen's novel Azorno, in which we don't know who's who in the narrative, and it becomes, and I can read a tiny bit of the opening and then what Denise Newman wrote, who actually translated the book, which is great, which is another thing about the poet's relationship to the work is often very intense and intimate. She translated the book, so she'll know it in a way that we don't know. And I think of Inger Christensen as this amazing writer in terms of structure, with her, especially her book Alphabet, with the based on the Fibonacci sequence, and it's also an abecedarian. And even if you didn't know those things, it's just astounding. So Denise Newman writes about the structure in Azorno. But here's the very beginning of the translation. I've learned that I'm the woman he first meets on page 8. It was Azorno who told me, come to think of it. I've never dared to ask him why he's Azorno. We were supposed to meet just to the right of the main entrance under those big trees where people wait so they won't get in anyone's way. I was wearing a white hat, and when I passed through the turnstile, everything fell completely silent. The man waiting for me wasn't Azorno. Within a second, my blood, my thoughts, nerves, and senses were swept back 10 years, and I think I felt like a diver who finds himself at the bottom of the ocean one minute and on solid ground the next, unable to hear whether the others are saying he's dead or alive, because he's encapsulated in a silence as vast as if he'd brought the ocean up with him, and it surrounded him now like a huge bell that no one could pass through without drowning. So that's the opening of Azorno. And then Newman says, Azorno is a short novel set in modern Europe and told in the first person. Beyond these facts, it's as difficult to summarize as it is to draw a map of a labyrinth from the inside. It concerns 5 women and 2 men, a novelist named Sample and his main character named Azorno. They each have personality traits, some mutually inclusive, some mutually exclusive, and 4 dwelling places. The challenge is to figure out which character has which traits and live where. At first, we're given to believe that the novel is about love and betrayal, and it goes on and on. So it keeps disrupting so that what I just read, it sounds like it's a transparent, we know what's happening, but that is very quickly goes away, and so that keeps happening again and again, and there's this feeling of silence, of being under the water. And in looking for Livingston, which is M. Orbezi Philippe's novel, there are all these times where the word silence is an anagram, and there's a traveler moving through time which has no relation to our time now. And every place that the traveler arrives is a different anagram of the word silence, but you don't realize this when you first start out. So she writes, for the ancestors who have been silent for too long and whose silence is always, that's the epigraph. And it starts out, the 400th day in the 16th month of the 10,000th year of our word, 1,500 hours, I have been traveling in circles these past 100 years, circle upon circle, ever widening. As I went, I questioned, with very little success, everyone I met about what I was searching for. And what was I searching for? I was not at all sure, had only the barest intimations of what it might be. I often dreamed I was showing someone my maps. One, by taking them from my bag, each map is blank. Faster and faster, I keep discarding them, becoming more and more upset. The last one I take out is an old piece of parchment, covered with markings, drawings, and words, none of which I understand. Try as I might, though, I cannot make sense of this dream. As soon as you see it, you will recognize it. This was what the women told me when I arrived in the land of S. Nellis. So I'll just read a tiny bit that Sonnet L'Abbé wrote about it, and then I'll ask you. Looking for Livingston begins with the narrator setting out on a journey to discover something as yet unidentified. She begins her search before she knows exactly what she is looking for, but suspects that her compulsion to discover is related to the fervor that propelled the 19th century Scottish physician and missionary Dr. David Livingstone into the interior of Africa. Where was I going? I had forgotten where I had come from, knew I had to go on. I will open a way to the interior or perish. Livingstone's own words, I took them as my own motto. He was shown the falls of Moziatanyu, the smoke that thunders by the indigenous African, and discovered it. So there's a lot to say here. Despite Philippe's frequent association with language school poets because of her insistence on the material of language and her willingness to look at language as an artist looks at paint, her drive in looking for Livingston is toward an affirmation of interiority, not a negation of it, or of lyric subjectivity. Looking for Livingston uses the strategies of innovative poetry to narrate her Black subject's successful quest to, quote, open a way to the interior or perished.
Terrific. So I have a somewhat spontaneous response in the work that I wrote on Gail Scott's obituary of the Minnie. And so I'm going to see if I can make this contribution, but I have a passage on silence in it, and I'm going to see if I can find it quickly. Yes. So I write, within artistic genres, silence is associated with negative spaces in visual art and poetry, and with the stop or pause of music. Silence may be perceived as an absence in an otherwise sound-filled chamber. The flute goes mute, or outside space. In plotted narrative, silence is the site of the secret and its discovery. In psychoanalytic theory, silence is associated with a myriad of concepts, including Abraham and Torok's crypt, which renders the lost object inaccessible to the language of psychic processing or introjection. Silence is a psychosocial dynamic. As a social psychodynamic may encourage noise about X that covers up anxiety about Y. In politics, silence may be associated with the privilege of power to hold knowledge close and cover up or lie. Historical narration is formed by the impossibility of telling everything, by the surprise appearance that changes expectations or the course of events, by what is excluded for its apparent insignificance or political antagonism to a dominant perspective, and by revision. And I think suddenly I thought, well, this is interesting to put Gail's novel, the obituary of the Minnie in some way is seated around a history of colonization of indigenous people and death, and also the ambiguous relationship that many people in Canada, including Gail, have to what their understanding of what occurred historically is and how it is imprinted in their own bodies and lives and languages. And so in this case, it's hard to isolate her mode of writing in relationship to the concerns of language to that particular topic, but it's imbued with it in this particular book, and the inflections of the polyphonic prose that are coming from these different figures. They're like narrative figures in the work that are spatially connected and not existing in the same plane. So there's this bottom historian who's, this figure who's sort of writing at the bottom of the text commentary, and then there's a fly and a person that's maybe inert laying on a bed, or maybe a kind of ghost of herself traveling through Montreal. And each of these figures has, their language is quite differently inflected, but there's also a narrative mode that encompasses and enfolds all of them in it. But there's always this sense of not a positivization in the way that I think Norbesi is sort of retrieving something, but it's more of a kind of haunted and melancholic set of relationships and tonalities that are about not being able to access even the sound, something about the sound of accent and cadence within the language. And so and that's where, like, I think the poetry in her novel writing is, comes into this kind of presence. It's a kind of really pressured relationship of language from Francophone language to English language. So when we're talking about language, it's like literally the languages that people speak to. Some indigenous languages that are inflected sonically in the mind of the writing subject, and also within the ambience of Montreal that she's recording. And so this is like this not completely palpable presence, but yet is very much what is making the writing happen in it. And maybe I'll just read a little bit from the beginning of her work to also show how, like, the idea of genocide isn't historically stabilized, but it becomes a modern trans-historical event. And this is, these wars on the radio are keeping us from our own. In Pale Mile End, behind the night sheds, little pink clouds come tippling down, and huge yellow maple leaves, not cold enough to turn red, tumbling on regrowing November grass to lie like yellow hands from the kitchen radio, the ack swat of the most sophisticated of bombs, way up to 2 tons from the most fantastically shaped planes. OX, do you remember when Afghan spelt dope? Embroidered vests, vast, windswept steps with tanned, shaggy fashion models standing slant on them. I'm that face in the third. She looks out, barely behind those gray Venetians in upper triplex window, this former resident of Madame B's in the town of St. has a reputation for hating children. I also liking cats, enough not to have one. There's a lot of, like, really extraordinary kind of blending of images that are registering this, like the hands of the tumbling leaves are like body parts. Like, it's these like tragic images that are interleaved with these kinds of, like, just everyday, very comically represented irritations that also often have to do with questions of property and proprietorship and sort of like ownership of space, which is
Central
yeah,
issue.
yeah.
That's fantastic. I wonder if now we should
Yeah.
give it to open
Yeah,
up the conversation.
it seems like we've been talking for a
right.
long time.
And I just want to mention, as people are gathering questions, that Carla's novel, The Gardener of Stars, I always forget if there's a the.
Gardener of Stars.
No, the. Gardener of
Gardener
Stars.
of
There is
Stars,
an
a
essay.
novel. Yeah.
Will you hold up the book so people can see?
Yes.
There's an essay on her novel, Gardener of Stars, in this book. So read
By
that.
Laynie Browne.
By Laynie Browne.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. First question.
So, hi. Yeah, so I'm trying to form a question to both of you that will sort of encompass this incredibly wide inquiry that you're making into the relationship between poetry and poetics and the novel. And so one approach, I think, would be to think about, what the task of the novel is or has been, and how to think about the ways that the novel constructs readership and then satisfactions for the reader. So I'm looking at a table in Literati bookstore in Ann Arbor, and I'm seeing the corporatization of the novel, and it's a mass-produced feed where every year in and year out, you're going to have, the production of novels. But one way of thinking about that is the novel addresses a certain kind of a demand in the reader, and it satisfies it in a certain way, okay? So then, and there are theorists of the novel who actually focus on that as a kind of reason why the novel is what it is, why it's important. So there's a social reading of the novel, there's Lukács, I think Sartre's defense of prose as opposed to poetry. So then imagine poetry has a different set of tasks. You know, what I guess the question I'm asking is, given the fact that the novel has a kind of reproduction of itself in this kind of satisfaction with the reader, what does it mean to bring the focus on language that comes out of poetics, comes out of poetry, to this genre, right, which is all set up as a business proposition? It's shipping units, and you know we're cutting down trees, and we're producing these books, and so it's an open question. But in the novels that call themselves novels as such, I see the satisfactions of the novelistic. You know, that there's something. Sally Rooney, I read one of her novels. Why do people read a novel by Sally Rooney? Because it's a satisfaction in it that they've read a novel. There's something really circular about it. So what I want to throw back to you is the way in which what you're doing, the question you're asking about the relationship between poetry and the novel, deals with a different kind of task, a different way of thinking about a satisfaction in the reader. I hope that's efficiently stated.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah. You start.
Well, I feel like there's so many reasons why, and one thing I would do is restate or translate that question into why does a poet write a novel? Like, what are the reasons? And that was a question I had, and one thing I learned in working on this book is that there are many reasons why a poet might turn to prose. So one reason is to see, can I do it? This is a question I had. Can I pay attention long enough to do it? And another reason that comes up is that sometimes the material that the poet wants to present, this particular material, they don't want to write it in poetry. And another reason is, if I think about a novel as a place to dwell, a book of poetry or poems can be a place to dwell, but it's different than dwelling inside a novel. And inside, I guess the difference is inside the sentence. So I feel like both prose poetry and the new sentence, first of all, prose poetry is an oxymoron, which Rachel Blatty-Plessy pointed out in her essay on Stein, I think. And also poet's novel is an oxymoron. But I think of a novel as this commodious house to hang out in a different way than hanging out in a poem. I realize that that's kind of vague, but maybe that's the best I can do in that moment. But that's another reason, is that I want to be in the sentence in a way that's different, even if it's not a novel in a conventional way. So those are my first thoughts.
And that also, I guess, approaches the question of, I think what Barrett's talking about, which is like reception. Mm-hmm. The book he talked about you can buy at the airport. There's fewer and fewer books that you can buy at the airport, however. So there's maybe a relationship also to a different idea of a subject that's reading the novel, that's closer to the way that you dwell in a novel when you're reading it. So it's an event of reading, so it's going to have a very different readership, but some of this really has to do with the politics of the novel. And I just wanted to read, this is really interesting because Roberto Bolaño is represented in this anthology, and Joshua Maria Wilkinson writes about his first novel, which Joshua can also read as a poem, and so, but it's a work, or as a poetic work in prose. But it's a work by somebody who feels like he's a failed poet, if he's a poet at all, and goes on to write this large body of literature that's read around the world. And I mean, I don't know how many people who read Rooney's novels read Bolaño's novels. I would have no idea. But he writes, this is right at near the beginning. He's sometimes really polemical in this, and I really appreciate that about his essay. Surely somebody has said it more elegantly elsewhere in these pages, so I'll put it bluntly. Any fictional prose out of keeping with popular mainstream markets is often derided, dismissed, or simply ignored. To cite a recent example, last week when the New York Times asked Anna Quindlen, what kinds of stories are you drawn to? Any you steer clear of? Her reply is, I think experimental fiction is a synonym for give me a break. So we live in the break. It's like that's, so there's a kind of, really interested in sort of pursuing that question, but I'm trying to figure out how to, because it's almost like you're talking about life forms within readerships.
I have an idea, though. I feel like there's no reason why poetry isn't in the airport. There's no good reason. And in fact, I was in LAX recently, and was it LAX? I think it was. And there was lots of beautiful books of poetry. Now it was. It was LA, which is where I'm from. And I bought all these books of poetry in the airport.
That's extremely unusual.
Yeah, and I thought, well, maybe we just need to go and put books of poetry in the airport, right? There was a book by Victoria Chang's new book called Obit, which is amazing. And there was Sheila Heti's new book, and she's a great example. Like, she doesn't write poetry, but her new book, Pure Color, I read it, and I think, okay, if this was written by a poet, it wouldn't be getting the attention that it's getting. Like, it's very good. But what she's doing, poets have been doing for a long time. So if that book can be in the airport, then...
But I guess I want to push back.
Right.
Okay. So, like I'm talking about sort of a discourse, and great, there's a book buyer in the airport that realizes that all these people go through LA, and it's like this amazing sort of cultural center with so many different people flowing through it, that it catalyzes something that allows for poetry to be in the airport. But so Joshua Maria Wilkins is doing something that's kind of, to me it's so obvious, but I think it's important to acknowledge. He goes on to say, here's David Foster Wallace, a writer that many poets sort of like to embrace and have a lot of heart toward, and he's a tragic figure. And this is what David Foster Wallace, also from an interview published posthumously, says, I think avant-garde fiction has already gone the way of poetry, and it's become involuted and forgotten the reader. Put it this way, so what's the reader? The construction of the reader is part of what we're talking about. Put it this way, there are a few really good poets who suffered because of the desiccation and involution of poetry, but for the most part, I think American poetry has gotten what it's deserved. And it'll come awake again when poets start speaking to people who have to pay their rent and fuck the same woman for 30 years. That's off the record. That's really nasty. And, I feel like my prose, and one of the reasons why I actually had trouble with poetry, has something to do with exactly what he said at the end of his book, which is, I was saying, fuck the guy who thinks that is what the position of a woman is in relationship to the literary. And all of my work from the age of 18 forward is saying fuck you to that. So, if nobody reads it, okay, but it's like, no, that's not true that nobody reads it, but it's a different, so there's a lot of ideas out there that are captured and have the appeal of the commodity, including that statement. It's appealing as a commodified statement. Now, and so then most airports that I've been in recently in the United States only have, what is it, the New York Review of Books seal of approval. That's the only books that are in there. And you pick up one after the other and read 3 pages in 30 seconds. It's like they just wash over you, like, and then I feel guilty saying that because somebody wrote that. It's a work of somebody's labor. It's how they're making their living. So that's a kind of, contradiction, I guess, or tension. But so, questions?
Is there another question?
Does anybody else have a question here or online? I'll remind you, you can drop a question in the chat.
Do you have a question?
Oh, thank you for saving my computer. Where'd the water go? Oh, I see it just.
Oh, no.
If I need my computer, I will fetch it.
Okay.
Put this over here.
Is there a question from online?
No questions online.
No questions.
Um,
Wow. Well, we can pause.
Yeah, okay. And we may...
Obviously,
There's a lot
thought
there.
in this area, and there are huge numbers of things. But going back to Victor Shklovsky, okay, so he's a major figure in poetics, but his major work is theory of prose. So he finds those elements in prose that in fact are that which the poetic, is based on. And we go from there to the whole structuralist account of poetics. So then there's the theory of the novel, and we've got, that long tradition. What I'm trying to do is compare what the novelistic is, okay, and that's like Bakhtin actually is the theorist who gets you from the formalist account into something where this kind of reception or reproduction of the novel happens. And so for Bakhtin, the novel is a moment of expanding the literary toward the everyday. It's a democratization. So, I don't know, there was this one passage where somebody's standing with their hat on, somewhere. In poetry, that would maybe in Pushkin, there might be like some detail like that. But in the novel, it's everything where somebody's standing with their hat on. And so the novel extends this kind of everydayness, this kind of temporality, and explores it, and then makes it, recovers it, makes it meaningful. When Foster Wallace says something like, you got to appeal to a person who's having sex with the same person for 30 years, he's still talking about that every day that Shklovsky's theorizing back then with the concept of wit. Okay, that's the baseline that the novel is going to address. So
is Shklovsky focusing on democratization?
No, Shklovsky opens up the question of the relationship of the literary to that which it defamiliarizes, which is the habituated, the everyday. So when you bring the two together, his account of prose it allows you to make the stone stony, to really see what the life that you're living is. Okay, so the defamiliarization lays bare the device. With Bakhtin, this notion of the novelistic, I think, is the really important point. There's a democratization that goes along with it, and it's an extension into the everyday. So if I were to take that to what you read, I'd say both of you are radically exploring the everyday as a poetics, right? And so one aspect of the novelistic that you're learning from is the way that you can actually bring the everyday into what is radically poetic about it, as opposed to what reproduces what Foster Wallace is talking about or provides the satisfaction that Sally Rooney's novel gives you, which is the satisfaction of reading a novel. And that's all. So what I'm trying to do is compare the novelistic satisfaction, okay, to poetic satisfaction.
Well,
Right?
maybe maybe some of the works that are under discussion don't draw that line so easily. That there's more than one kind of satisfaction. But then I was also thinking that there's, and that, you know, if we had all night, I would guess I would have gone into The Great American Novel by William Carlos Williams, which I think one of the really stunning essays in the anthology by Sarah Vapp is this like fierce response to the Great American Novel, which matches, I mean, she's absolutely identifies with the book, and she is also relentlessly looking at it critically. And through her own time. So it's a wonderful moment where she's sort of matching the ferocity of Williams' prose with her own sensibility at this moment. So it's a fascinating text. But The Great American Novel, is that a crisis in democracy that Williams is pointing to? And so then I'm thinking, is this one significant strand of the poet's novel might have something to do with a crisis in democracy, and that is related to the kind of, you know, Joshua Maria Wilkins is obviously coming from the position of the critique of the commodity in that particular passage in his essay, but there's all sorts of crises of democracy. And I think that the works that we read from, like Norbesi Phillips and Gail Scott's work, are also potentially thought of in that framework as some kind of crisis. But in Williams' Great American Novel, it's like the idea of American is impossible. It's untrue. And so the novel he's not writing a great American novel, it's ironic, and there can't be a great American novel. And so and it's based on considerations of economic inequality, the lives of immigrants, class, race. It's the inability of the American narrative to democratically address the population of America is the disturbance of the novel that isn't a novel. So
I'll just try to respond briefly by saying that of the different kinds of satisfaction, if they're different between a novel and a poem, I want it both. So I'm going to refuse again to choose or to even admit that they're necessarily different things, but that I want it simultaneously. And I refuse to draw the line. So it is absurd because I basically don't care about lines and genres, yet I'm also obsessed with all the genres. And when we talk about democratization of the form, the first thing that comes to mind in this minute is Kevin Killian's, the piece on Kevin Killian by Browne that's about his Amazon reviews. And so if we want to talk about what's wrong with the great American anything, I think that that's a really brilliant form that Kevin, that it's interpreted as a novel, all of these reviews, and it has the added benefit of being a scathing critique, but also funny.
It's very funny, yes.
Yeah,
but also, so is Brandon.
He's very funny.
He's very witty, and the novel exists somewhere between Kevin Killian and Brandon Browne. It's like not either. To me, it's so like neither. Great. It's like the novel is.
It's not even written.
No, it's not. It's not written. I mean, Brandon Browne has to draw from Lukács to apply the concept of the epic. So the Amazon reviews, he goes back to epic poetry and then draws from, so there's all these sleights of hand in order to call up the novel. So you're thinking about the novel, but you're really thinking about Brandon Browne's deftness in writing this essay about these reviews.
And it really
that are an act of revolt against the commodity and participating in it at the same
And I
time.
feel like
So-
that's great that you just said it's the novel between them, because also I wouldn't have thought to choose the Amazon reviews as a novel when there's other fiction that Kevin wrote that is fiction. That was Brandon's idea to choose that, and that made it into the novel in the book.
Yep.
The unwritten novel between them and the essay on the reviews as a novel.
So are there any other questions? Great, yeah.
Oh, good.
Oh, hold on, Carl, let me give you this microphone, and then,
This is just a question. Is there, or what would be the difference between your appreciation of a long poem and a novel?
What would be the difference between my appreciation?
Okay.
I think it's a different experience in time.
Mhm.
Like I'm thinking about Bernadette Mayer's Midwinter Day,
Right.
and how many times I've read it. I've probably read that poem more times than I've read any novel, because it's a poem and not a novel. But I don't know, because I feel like there's certain novels that I reread in time. I'm going to say Virginia Woolf, but again, I could say The Waves is a poet's novel, even though I had to draw a line to make this book not thousands of pages. And so one of those lines that I drew that isn't a line and it doesn't exist is, okay, Virginia Woolf's primarily known as a novelist, so we're not going to have an essay on the waves. And, Proust is known as a novelist, so we're not going to have In Search of Lost Time, or we're not going to have Moby Dick, right? But those lines don't exist, and they're ridiculous. It's just because I had to make some parameters.
I'm thinking about Nathaniel Mackey's serial novel.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that astonishes me about his serial novel is that there's this switching that's happening between narrative that's like inside the musical mind and something that's like sonically driving it. And sometimes when I'm reading it, I think, this is what I want from poetry. And so there's something maybe also about what poetry can achieve, but it's achieving it in this prose form, and so it's also something else. And then, like I've been reading Lynn Heginian's A Night of a Thousand Eyes recently, so that's a big long poem, and it's in fragments, and it's time-based, so it's a kind of interesting comparison, but each one is, like each of the poems is sort of its own entity that's making a relationship to something that comes before or after it, so you're like looking at it like as an object in a different way, so that the relationship of what the language is doing as an object, like there's this visual aspect to that poem that creates a kind of pause in how one sees the work. And so I don't think how I see Jabat Bogostis' Run by Nathaniel Mackey. I think about how I hear it. And I'm not sure I could generalize through that, but it's just the beginning of comparing two different experiences of the novel by a poet and a long poem by a poet.
So Rosemary Waldron wrote that,
A form of taking it all,
Hanky Epistles,
and the hanky,
but then she wrote
right.
much earlier a poem, A
What is that book? Which book is that in? The Ambition of Ghosts. A
Yeah, I
pamphlet?
don't know that book. Mhm.
Huh. I'm gonna go find that.
But it's a similar subject. It's that kind of the German divorce that happens, in Germany between, or that happened, no, that happens in Germany between national resentment and family or whatever. I'm not sure. I don't know how to say that, but it's a really interesting.
So
thing.
I feel like you're pointing to another question that's really important in the book, which is, what is the relationship of the poet's novel to the poet's work throughout their life? And that's a really interesting question. There's a relationship, and it's not always the same.
Well,
but
then another example would be we have a reading group that we do, and we were reading Reznikov's testimony, and so I was reading. It was an excuse to read Reznikov, and I read his novel called The Lionhearted, which is basically about the same thing as Holocaust is about. But when we were reading testimony, people couldn't get past the story. It didn't end up in the group being treated as, I think, as prose. It was kind of disappointing. It was not kind of, it was really disappointing.
So when you're trying to write about something that's impossible to approach or impossible to get that close as a secondary witness, then we just keep coming back, right? So you try in poetry, you try in prose, you try in any form you can, right, as an artist. I think that's one thing that comes up with content, being obsessed with certain content and how to get at it. And so trying in all different forms. I don't know.
Speaking of lines and in defense of airport bookstores, when Crystal text in the Milwaukee airport.
Wow.
Are you kidding?
Amazing.
But so maybe we need more used bookstores in airports or nonprofit bookstores.
Okay.
But there was always a dilemma here: do we shelve them together? And if we do shelve them together, then the volumes of poetry sort of disappear in the space that's dedicated to making poetry available.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, shout out to Renaissance Books. Well, this
Fantastic.
has been wonderful, and I could keep listening, but perhaps, maybe
it's been
informally
a
people
while.
can carry on the discussion. But thank you so much,
Thank
both of
you
you.
all.
This has been fantastic, and everybody here and out there, and have a great night.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for the book. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for staying.